Okay, students, now that we've covered the Native American aspect of the Mexican identity, of the Latino identity, let's recognize the importance of some terms here. Let's recognize the importance of migration. Now, hopefully what you understood from Unit 1 is that as far as Native North America and Central America is concerned, people have been in constant motion throughout this continent, especially in the area that's known as the Southwest United States and Northern Mexico today, that which forms our border today. Baja California, Sonora, which is below Arizona, Chihuahua, which is below New Mexico, which is next to Texas, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas, which is next to South Texas. That is the area known as the Southwest United States and Northern Mexico today. And so people have been going back and forth across this present-day U.S.-Mexico border and all borders of nations in the Western Hemisphere since time immemorial. I hope you got that from the native traditions. And let's understand that the region and the people reflect the diversity that is prevalent today. You know, when we go around the present-day United States, it has been home to culturally diverse populations since time immemorial. The U.S. contains an environmental and geographic diversity that is impressive and awe-inspiring. Native peoples develop specific linguistic heritages reflecting their interaction with the environment. And since time immemorial, people have uniquely responded to the environmental and geographic diversity that was commonly referred to by native populations as our Mother, the Earth. Many of you wrote some outstanding essays and exposés on the native contribution to the identity. So let's understand something about the immigration process. It's a decision by an individual or a family to migrate. So migration is a movement from one place to another. Now, we in the United States take migration largely for granted, but people are constantly migrating. It is a phenomenon that has been taking place since the original inhabitants of this land have existed and taught us how to appreciate the earth. So people since time immemorial have moved across this turtle's back, from the deserts to the plains, from rivers to coastlines, and for what? For economic survival. So today we see people move from city to city or region to region, and what are they doing? They're searching for economic existence. So when migration or a movement of population occurs and the people cross a political boundary created by modern nation states, it is called by different names: emigration or immigration. But at the basic level, it is still migration. Emigration means leaving one country. Immigration refers to entering another country. So we're going to learn in this course, emigration and immigration are collective terms. Individuals who leave one country are immigrants, and when they enter a new country, they become immigrants. Now, one of the reasons why people are in constant motion is that they are searching for opportunities to continue their economic existence. So people are constantly searching for economic survival. And most often people want to make sure that they can achieve a subsistence level that guarantees that their families will be fed, clothed, and sheltered. So it's in this way that we can appreciate that throughout human history, people have migrated throughout the world in search of a decent human existence. And likewise, it is important to understand that wherever economic systems have been established, labor forces are required to create the infrastructure that facilitates the exchange of goods and services. So consequently, history reveals that systems are constantly looking to form and control labor forces so as to create markets, as well as build the monumental architecture that's designed to enhance the exchange of goods and services. So throughout history, we witnessed the formation and control of labor forces in order to facilitate the enhancement of economic growth and development. So whether these labor forces be organized through voluntary labor agreements or through enslaved labor or through contractual forms of labor, systems desire people's skills. Systems desire their knowledge, their experience, or their assets. So it's in this way that systems recruit workers. And workers migrate to areas where their labor is valued, required, and appreciated. So we want to understand that throughout the historical development of Mexico, of the Western Hemisphere, of British America, of French America, of Spanish America, there is a constant need to form and control labor forces. So when the United States is created, when Mexico is created, when the Caribbean nations are created, when Central American nations are created. There will be there's a continuity here because there's constant need to form and control labor forces. So this need to form and control labor forces is tied to government policy and international relations. So today, when you take a look at businesses in the United States, they rely upon the federal government to find them workers. And this is the key here. And since the colonial era, governments have been involved in securing voluntary and involuntary immigrants to this country. It is part of international policy. Mexican government, the Caribbean governments, the U.S. federal government has been actively recruiting labor forces since their inception. So treaties and negotiations are entered into to bring labor forces into the United States, primarily for economic development and growth. So labor recruitment is central to the migration of populations to the Western Hemisphere in general, and to the United States in specific, since the colonial period. Okay, let's try to understand some concepts with regard to work. When we take a look at wage labor is basically a socioeconomic relationship between a worker and an employer. And the worker is going to sell their labor under a formal contract or an informal employment contract. So these transactions usually occur in a labor market where wages are market determined. So in exchange for the wages paid, the work product generally becomes the property of the employer, except for special cases like the vesting of intellectual property patents in the United States, where patent rights are always invested in the original personal inventor. But nonetheless, a wage laborer is a person whose primary means of income is from the selling of his or her labor in this way. So we all know that in modern mixed economies such as that of the United States, wage labor is the dominant form of work arrangement. But the work arrangement is important so that wage labor is considered to apply to unskilled, semi-skilled, and manual labor. Then there's another kind of servitude. There's two kinds of servitude, One is known as indenturedness, and the other is slavery. An indentured servitude refers to the historical practice of contracting to work for a fixed period of time, typically 3 to 7 years, in exchange for transportation, food, clothing, lodging, and other necessities during the term of indenture. So usually indentured servants included men and women, and most were under age 21, and most became helpers on farms. They performed manual labor or house servants performing domestic servitude. Indentured servants were not paid in wages because cash was in too short supply for that, but it was a system in the colonial period that provided jobs and, most importantly, transportation for poor young people from the overcrowded labor markets of Europe to labor-short Americas. Then there is slavery, and slavery is a system under which people are treated as property and are forced to work. Now, slaves can be held against their will from the time of their capture, purchase, or birth, and deprived of the right to leave, to refuse to work, or to demand compensation. So conditions that can be considered slavery include debt bondage, indentured servitude, serfdom, domestic servants that are kept in captivity, adoption in which children are effectively forced to work as slaves, children who are recruited as soldiers, and forced marriage. So let's understand these forms of work: wage labor, and then the two types of servitude, indentured and slavery, because these are very important in terms of the formation and control of labor forces. Now, prior to the establishment of British colonies on the mainland of the eastern part of the United States today, and so I'm hoping that all of you understand geography here. One of the things before the British colonies even were established in the Americas, Spain had over 100 years of establishing labor forces, forming and controlling labor forces in areas that are part of the United States today. Primarily they were in Florida and New Mexico. And likewise, prior to the United States independence movement from England, areas that became known as Texas, Arizona, and California witnessed market expansion through the use of diverse ethnic populations as labor forces. So what is important to note about the formation and control of labor forces, especially about the United States labor history, is that the United States has a rich Mexican foundation of workers, and they are rooted in Spanish colonial expansion. So when we talk about the United States, before the United States even came to the Southwest, there was already the formation and control of labor forces in Florida, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and California. So please keep that in mind, students. Okay, so when we take a look at the Mexican experience in the United States, it has a very diverse and challenging history that we need to seriously understand and come to terms with, especially with regards to the politics surrounding the creation of an immigration policy today. When you take a look at what's happening right now with regards to immigration, that policy is going to affect every Mexican's existence as a human being today. So everyone is talking about the Mexican. What to do with the Mexican. So when we talk about the Mexican experience, first and foremost, as I shared with you in Unit 1, we must root that discussion in native thoughts, practices, and beliefs. You see, the foundation of the Mexican existence is native traditions, and I hope you learned that from Unit 1, because these are traditions that are rooted in the land and the linguistic expressions that are found today in the area known as the United States Southwest and northern Mexico. So it is in the spirit of the Mexican existence today to recreate native people's expressive mobility. It is this that I hoped you gained from Unit 1. And central Mexico has always been the place that has funneled people north to Canada and south to the Andes mountain ranges since the rise of the Olmecs 5,000 years ago. I asked many of you to do an assignment with regards to the interconnectedness of the Western Hemisphere, and many of you just missed understanding that significance. It was disheartening for me because it seemed that you were not paying attention to the interconnectedness of the message. Today, if you take a look at why Mexicans can be found as laborers everywhere in the Western Hemisphere, is that they are just following the ancient patterns of migration. People traveled from Michoacan to northern Michoacan, which is known as Michigan today. And of course, if you got tired along the journey, because that's a long way from Michigan or Michoacan in Mexico all the way to northern Michoacan, which is Michigan. And then if you get tired along the way, well, in Spanish it's called si te cansas. So if you get tired, there's always Kansas City where you can rest along the way. Anyway, that was supposed to be a joke. But the term Mexican is of Nahuatl origin. It comes from Mexica. Mexica means to be human. Mexica refers to our humanity. And this term originated in a place that came to be identified as the center of the universe. And that place was Tenochtitlan. So I'm going to rehearse your understanding of Tenochtitlan, and we're going to revisit the documentary entitled Engineering an Empire by the History Channel and hosted by Peter Weller. And let's pay attention again to the importance of labor in constructing the monumental architecture that is necessary to create imperial markets.
Today, this once vast and open valley is teeming with what is modern-day Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. But 700 years ago, the island was so swampy, no one had laid claim to it. Now, as they gazed on the lake, the Aztec leader Tenoch announced to his followers that he had seen an eagle perched on a cactus in the middle of the lake, a sign from the gods that they had found their new home. They would name their city Tenochtitlan. Life is tough for the Aztecs in the early days of Tenochtitlan, but they have a vision of a powerful city modeled on an ancient and legendary city just 25 miles away. They called this city Teotihuacan, or City of the Gods.
We know very little about Teotihuacan because all we have is the archaeological remains. We don't have any writing, we don't have any documentation that really fleshes out what went on at this big city.
It was in ruins, even in Aztec times, but they believed it to be the stomping grounds of the gods and the literal birthplace of the sun itself. The place the Aztecs most revered in Teotihuacan was a pyramid that rose above the tree line. It was called the Pyramid of the Sun. The massive Sun Pyramid contains 1,000,000 cubic yards of earth and stone, with a base roughly the same as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. The Aztecs believed Teotihuacan was laid out in the image of the cosmos, created by their gods. Now it was this image they would attempt to replicate in the construction of their new city, Tenochtitlan. Taking on the challenge would be an Aztec leader named Acamapichtli. In 1376, he embarked on an ambitious plan to engineer an advanced city at Tenochtitlan. But there was a problem.
The swampy islands that they took over needed a lot of work. When they started to build anything, it would begin to subside.
There was simply no foundation on which to build. The Aztec solution would revolutionize the architecture of the Americas. They began by anchoring their buildings deep in the ground using a system of pilings made from wood. Workers cut stakes into 30-foot lengths, 3 to 4 inches wide. These were driven into the soft ground to make a foundation. The pilings were often surrounded with volcanic stone to add strength. Masons and bricklayers could then build walls on top of this base with confidence.
They have found wooden pylons to hold the foundations of the pyramids. The fact that it didn't sink or the fact that it didn't just topple, I think that's a major feat of engineering.
Tenochtitlan was an island city, but the lakes surrounding it were very shallow, sometimes only 7 feet deep. The whole thing looked like a giant metroplex floating on a pond. Originally, the only way to get from this floating city to the mainland was by boat. But the Aztecs eventually devised a series of causeways, sometimes 45 feet wide, that would connect their floating city to the mainland provinces. The causeway was supported by strong wooden pilings, the same pilings that supported their temples and other buildings. Thousands of these pilings had to be driven deep into the lake bed, and this presented a logistical challenge that could only be met by a strong, skilled labor force and the best of Mesoamerica's engineers.
To build a causeway, 2 lines of stakes were laid out. Then the space between them was filled with stones and earth until it reached several feet above the water level. This allowed the road to support enormous weight.
These causeways were built very straight, they were very wide, with bridges that would open up that connected the city to the north, to the west, and to the south.
The roads enabled the Aztecs to transport larger, heavier materials for building. But this presented a new challenge.
There were no beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, so everything had to be done with humans. No carts, no wheel.
Small loads would be carried on the back with a rope hung from the forehead. Large items like stone blocks or sculptures for a temple would be dragged by huge numbers of men pulling ropes, possibly using logs as rollers. Legend has it one stone bound for a temple required a force of 50,000 men to drag it from the mountains on the mainland across the causeway and into the city. The causeways would also present the Aztecs with a new way to get fresh water to Tenochtitlan. In the past, the Aztecs had transported water in canoes from the shore. But a huge boom in the city's population meant they needed a higher-tech solution to keep up with demand.
Again, I'm playing for you this film clip again so that you can recognize the importance of the Mexica experience and the native background to the Mexicans today. Most importantly, when we talk about the Mexican experience, we have to appreciate that it forms the basis of all experiences of people from the Caribbean, from Central America, from South America, who are living in the United States today. Because eventually what happens to the Mexican, especially in terms of migration and immigration, in terms of formation of labor forces and control of labor forces, eventually what happens to the Mexican happens to everyone else with some modifications. And rooted in the Mexican experience is irrigation and agricultural expertise. Now, I'm going to go back to the film clip again, or back to the documentary again, so that we can understand the significance of water control and food production. You see, this rich heritage is what Americans take for granted as Americans shop for fresh produce at their local grocery. And they don't understand that it is Mexicans who have been providing that produce for the United States since the United States took over Mexico. Let's revisit the Chinampa system.
Clean water to their growing city. Remarkably, the Aztecs would independently design and build something that only a few world empires would master: the aqueduct. The aqueduct actually had two channels, each about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. One would be cleaned and maintained, while the other was being used so the water flow was never interrupted. The twin-tube aqueduct ran for 3 miles from the mainland to the center of the island city. In town, water streamed into public fountains and reservoirs, and was distributed to the public in large clay jars or by canoe.
In comparison to the Europeans, the Aztec were a very clean people. We know that the Aztec emperor bathed twice a day, so in terms of hygiene, the Aztec people was much more advanced than the Europeans.
While the Aztec nobles were bathing in luxury, at this time in Europe, plague caused by unsanitary conditions was killing millions. King Quetzalcoatl's own bath was one of the most unique in the Americas. It was fed by a sophisticated aqueduct system that also brought running water to his palace grounds.
Behind me is the hill of Tezcatzinco. And on this hill, Quetzalcoatl built a fantastic pleasure palace. And around this palace, a virtual botanical garden filled with all of the exotic flowers of Mesoamerica. Quetzalcoatl brought water from the Sierra Nevada mountains all the way down to here, into this hill, to his palace, just to water his plants.
To install an aqueduct there, Quetzalcoatl had to fill a huge gorge between Tezcatzinco and the next hill. As the water arrived at the first hill, it gathered in small pools built to control the speed of the flow before it reached the aqueduct. After crossing the aqueduct, the water ran in a circuit around Tezcatzinco Hill, spilling off over the sides in rock-cut waterfalls to water the gardens. It ended up in a nearly perfectly round rock-cut pool called the King's Bath.
And from here, he could look upon his domain at Texcoco, and he could look down at the botanical gardens that he was watering with his fantastic aqueducts. It is indeed a bath fit for a king.
By the mid-15th century, with their empire on the rise, it was time for the Aztecs to choose a sovereign leader. He was called Moctezuma, and he would be the first of 2 emperors with this now famous name. Moctezuma's first order of business was to extend the empire's borders. The Aztecs captured city-states southward to the valley of Oaxaca, westward to the Pacific, and east toward the Gulf of Mexico. By 1449, the empire contained as many as 15 million people. In the short span of 100 years, the Aztecs accomplished the impossible. They had toppled the Mesoamerican world order. But while the Aztecs dominated militarily, their island city was vulnerable to a different kind of enemy. Like New Orleans, Tenochtitlan was constantly doing battle with water. And one of Moctezuma's first projects was to protect his city from the deluge of water surrounding it.
This is what is left of Lake Xochimilco, in the southern part of Mexico City, in Aztec times, the city of Tenochtitlan. This lake, like the other 4 lakes that surrounded the city, were spring-fed. Thus, there were no rivers or streams into which it could drain. And if it rained hard enough, the water would rise up and sweep over the land and into the city itself. And this is exactly what happened in the mid-1400s when a flood of catastrophic proportions swept into Tenochtitlan. The city and the empire it commanded were almost completely destroyed, and the Aztec civilization had to once again rely upon the genius of its engineers, and one engineer in particular.
Moctezuma enlisted the help of his old ally Nezahualcóyotl to protect the city he was rebuilding from the lake. Nezahualcóyotl would design a solution that would make him the greatest engineer on the continent. His plan was to create a safe zone around the city with a huge dike that would protect Tenochtitlan and its inhabitants. It was designed to be larger than any earthwork anywhere in the Americas at the time, running for 10 miles just east of the city from the southern edge of the lake across to the north. The walls were a wickerwork construction made of sticks, reeds, stone, and earth. Since the lake was shallow, the dike was only about 12 feet in height, but some 27 feet wide. Nezahualcóyotl fitted the dike with sluice gates, most likely wooden doors that would be raised or lowered to control the water level behind it. The dike also served another purpose. It protected their water supply.
It was important to build some sort of protective mechanism to keep salt water out of the freshwater western part of the lake.
An army marches on its stomach, so said Napoleon. Now, an ample food supply for civilians is a no-brainer in the critical development of any civilization. But the Aztecs perfected a unique method, not only to provide a substantial food supply for its civilian populace, but to fuel the military expansion of its empire.
This revolutionary engineering was called chinampas, a system that allowed them to literally create new land to farm and to live on.
If you're going to have a city of any size, you have to provide room for them. And so what they did was build up these chinampas in the lake bed.
Basically, a chinampa is an artificial island built in the lake.
They looked like narrow football fields, about 300 feet long by about 30 feet wide. A chinampa was built by weaving a web of sticks floating in the water and piling reeds on top of them. Mud was then scraped from the lake bottom and piled atop the reeds to form the chinampa. It took 4 to 6 men 8 days to build the average chinampa. They were connected to the city by massive navigational canals that would take thousands of men months to build.
A chinampa like this one could produce up to 7 crops a year, whereas a farm on the mainland could yield 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most. As a crop was ready to harvest on a chinampa, seedlings from another would be sprouting out of mud that would be spread on a boat adjacent to the chinampa. Then when the seedlings were ready, they'd be transported to the chinampa, and this cycle would be repeated over and over and over again on hundreds and then thousands of chinampas. Now, it was this technology that transformed Tenochtitlan from just another tribal town in the 14th century to a dominant and thriving city-state.
So, okay, I just wanted to remind you again about Unit 1. The notion here is when we talk about the Mexican experience, it is rooted in native traditions. These are traditions that are rooted in the land, the linguistic expressions that are found today in California, in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, and then when you venture just across the border, Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas. So, again, rooted in the Mexican experience is irrigation and agricultural expertise. This is the rich heritage that we take for granted. today. Just take a look. Wherever you see an agricultural field, there are Mexicans working that field. So understand the rich heritage. Okay, stay tuned. This is the end of part 1 for this presentation.